Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our Rainbow Ecoscience webinar. Today, the webinar is Pacific Northwest, What's Bugging My Trees, Common Pests, and How to Manage Them.
All right, give me a second here. There we go. Nope, too far. There we go.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jessica Bergren. I'll be the moderator for this webinar. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager for Rainbow Ecoscience. If you're unfamiliar with Rainbow Ecoscience, we are an employee-owned company investing in research, education, and training that guides companies to keep their clients' properties healthy, beautiful, and less expensive to maintain. For more than 20 years, we have believed in supporting people and businesses to better manage the landscapes around us. Few housekeeping slides before I hand it over to Hannah. This webinar is being recorded, so if you'd like to go back and watch the recording, it will be on our YouTube channel in 24 hours. Reminder that we are approved for one ISA CEU. When you registered, you should have provided your credential numbers for receiving the credit. If you haven't, please just put that in the Q&A with your full name. Reminder that the chat is disabled, so in order to ask questions, put your number in there, please use the Q&A chat.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Mm. Okay, so again, yeah, welcome everyone. Hopefully, you're in the right webinar. If not, maybe you'll learn something new. But yeah, just to get right into it, I'm Hannah Horns. I'm a senior arboriculture advisor here at Rainbow, and that really means a lot of things, but basically I just do a lot of this. I talk at a lot of events, I do a lot of training, I answer a lot of questions from people out in the field. I do get out in the field and get to do some application training and field support, although not as much as our regional arborists. But my background really comes from the commercial tree care world. So I've been a plant healthcare tech, I've been a climbing arborist, and then I was in sales as well. So I also have a forestry degree from Iowa State, and then of course an ISA certified arborist. So today, the title really sums up what we're going to be talking about. So of course, we're going to be talking about common pests and diseases of the Pacific Northwest. I will caveat, this is not an exhaustive list. We'd probably have to be here for a few hours if we were really going to get into the details about everything that you might run into in your areas. But we're also going to talk about why management of certain issues matters, why maybe you don't want to do management or maybe seek an alternative to some sort of chemical application for some of these. And then we'll go into all the management options too for a handful of specific pests that I personally have gotten the most questions about working out in the Pacific Northwest. So to start here, hopefully I don't have to tell any of you that are on this webinar that trees are important. I'm assuming that's why you all are here. So when we're thinking about management and why we would even want to do anything about pests or diseases or even care about what's going on in our environments, it's because trees are important, right? There's a number of other things that trees provide us beyond what's just on this slide. And there's all the good touchy-feely stuff too, the way trees make us feel when we're around them, and then all of the hard number benefits that you can track back to trees too. However, I will make an argument. Trees grow here, right? So they grow in areas where they have co-evolved for millennia on, different tree species, different animals, different plants, the soil structure. This is where they like to be, and this is where they want to be. However, we like trees too for all of those benefits, right? So we put trees in situations like this. Poor root space, restricted root space, compacted soil, poor soil quality, not enough soil moisture, reflected heat. These trees in these spaces are extremely important to us, right? So you could argue that at this point, we've kind of made our bed, so it's now our responsibility to manage them appropriately to keep them around for the long term. So when we're talking about managing trees, I always like to go back to the spiral of tree decline. So there's a number of things that we can think about if we're thinking, intervention may or may not be necessary, or how much intervention we may need, or if it's even a matter that we want to pay attention to. So the spiral of tree decline, you'll see three different rungs, if you will, here. The first being predisposing factors. Those are things that I think of as generally ambient in the background. Of course, you see things on here like soil compaction and salt, but I think of them as they're pretty difficult to manipulate or change or manage, right? So you can't really change genetic potential, right? Air pollution's probably pretty difficult to change, especially in a city environment. So most trees that we're dealing with in our realms are already on this spiral of tree decline because they're already exposed to some sort of predisposing factor. The next rung, if you will, here is inciting factors. So that's going to be things like defoliating insects, drought, stuff that maybe, 1 year of a heavy defoliation event or 1 year of a really tough drought probably isn't going to be that big of a deal. But when we start to think about year after year after year compounding with something like soil compaction or urban environment, then we're starting to get our wheels turning of like, okay, this might be something that we actually do need to do some sort of intervention to prevent this tree from spiraling further down this decline and ending up in a poor state of living. The last rung here, we have contributing factors. So that's going to be things that really take advantage of a tree's weakened state. So it's going to be things like canker fungi or wooden bark boring insect. So once the tree is on this spiral of decline, all of these things contribute ultimately to death, right? So this should inform us where we are at in our management decisions, and kind of how much time relatively we have to manage a tree that's suffering from certain issues. Now, I will caveat that invasive pests don't really fit neatly into a lot of the boxes when we think about, where we're at with managing, what kind of intervention we could or couldn't do. Invasive pests kind of throw all of that out the window. We'll talk about emerald ash borer and Dutch elm disease later in this presentation, but they really don't fit neatly into these boxes. Oftentimes, it's either a do a treatment or remove. There's not a lot of leeway in with most invasive pests. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So it's also too important to remember that when we're going through management options today and when you're considering any sort of management option, we think of it through an IPM lens, so an integrated pest management lens. And really for me, the easiest way to remember that is just using a toolbox approach. So, it's not going to be a one size fits all for every single situation or every single pest or disease that we encounter in the landscape. We're not going to be doing, a spray and pray, this thing works for everything situation. We're going to be taking in a lot of different factors given our site and what we're trying to accomplish to manage the pest or disease appropriately. So first, that starts with diagnosing things correctly and making sure that you know the life cycle and what's going on. Reviewing both cultural and chemical control options. Again, we don't want to be just doing the spray and pray, hoping that if we just spray something year after year after year, we're going to be solving it completely. And then the application technique for the pest pathogen in site too, and we'll talk about that when we get into the specific pests and diseases. So to start here with just the different categories of insects that you might encounter in the landscape, this is important to inform you on what kind of management, especially if you're using a chemical application, what kind of technique, and then what kind of products you would be able to use given how these insects work in their biology. So starting off, we have our piercing sucking insects. Most common are going to be aphids, which we will talk about later, scales, adelgids, things like that, that literally have a piercing sucking mouth part, right? So they actually have this probus that goes in, sticks through the plant material, and then pulls out all the sugary goods in there, right? So piercing sucking insects, pretty easy to remember. Wood and bark boring insects, that would be something like a bronze birch borer or some bark beetles. Chewing insects, caterpillars, beetles, and then we have mites such as spider mites kind of on their own category. Their management is slightly different than some of the other insects, so put them in their own category. But it is important to note what kind of damage you would be looking at on a plant to know, to kind of clue you into what kind of insect you would be working with if you can't physically see that insect on the plant, right? And again, this is going to help inform what products you might use if you're going to be using some sort of chemical intervention. And then just a quick little bonus here too. Some of these insects don't fit super neat into these categories. So, there are things like clearwing moths that are Lepidoptera, which, technically could be in the caterpillars, but they are actually wooden bark boring insects. So just, being up to date on what's going on in your area and knowing the basics of insect categories and identification. So next we have categories of disease. We have foliar disease, which would be like an apple scab, or for a lot of you out there, cherry leaf spot. We also have vascular wilts, Dutch elm disease, oak wilt. You guys aren't really dealing with oak wilt yet, and hopefully you never do, like the most of the rest of the Midwest and the southern states. We also have bacterial diseases such as fire blight, and then canker fungi such as Cytospora. So just getting into the insects here that you might see, we're going to talk about piercing and sucking insects, and specifically I'm going to hone in on aphids. There's all kinds of other things that we could be talking about. So adelgids, lacebugs, psyllids, scales, both soft and armored. If I had, another 3 hours, we could definitely get into all of these, but aphids is something that I get a question on a lot. And luckily, they're a pretty easy pest to manage, and they don't always require some sort of intervention, but it is one of the most common pests that we see on the landscape. So going into detail about these little guys, there's a lot of different kinds of aphids, and they have a lot of different host species. So they're probably the most common pest that we would see in the environment. They're on small plants, they're on shrubs, they're on trees, they're on crops, right? They're kind of on everything in our that we would be dealing with. They come in a lot of different shapes and sizes too. So they're oval to pear shaped. They're pretty small. They may be black or brown or green or red or pink. Literally any color, it seems like. Some have transparent wings. Some are woolly, if you think about woolly aphids. Some are a little bit larger, like the giant conifer aphids. They really come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. But again, when we're talking about any of these insects or we're talking about any of these diseases, it is important to note the life cycle, because that's really going to clue us in for management, when we can apply certain products, and when it would be best to not. So talking about their life cycle, they basically stay in the egg stage all winter, and then in the spring they become mini adults, and then they move to their summer hosts, and then throughout the summer and fall is really when they are reproducing pretty rapidly. And an interesting thing about aphids is they give live birth, actually, which is pretty crazy. But they can reproduce really, really quickly and really take over a plant very rapidly. And I'm sure a lot of us on this call have probably experienced that. So just talking about, the impact, I know some of you are probably sitting there thinking like aphids, I'm not going to do anything about aphids. Why would I recommend doing any sort of intervention for aphids? There are a couple situations in which it might be warranted. Particularly really, really heavy infestations of aphids can actually lead to branch decline or dwarfed or stunted or deformed leaves. Now, the main reason I believe people typically will seek treatment options for aphids is due to the honeydew, right? So they're feeding by inserting their mouth parts into phloem vessels through the leaves and buds and stems, and then they're sucking out that sap, right? And then their excrement is what we call honeydew. So honeydew is the real problem when it comes to aphids. It's a mess. It can damage paint on cars. It attracts bees and wasps and ants, and it can produce sooty mold on there, which also will reduce the photosynthetic area of a plant as well. So it's not necessarily, the damage of the aphid itself that's causing that much issue, although when the populations are really heavy and built up, that can be an issue, but it's kind of all these other things, right? People don't like their patios to be covered in wasps and ants and bees, right? Especially when you're somewhere where you only have a small window to be outside or a nice season, right? So that's more so when I see, some sort of intervention necessary, but also thinking back to something like the spiralid tree decline. If you're having really, really heavy years of aphid infestations, that tree is going to be in a weakened state and potentially slip further down that spiral. So for treatment, the nice thing about aphids, they're one of the most common things we see, and they're one of the most they're pretty easy to control, I suppose. Almost anything works, and I say that obviously with a caveat. It's not that everything out there works, but you do have quite a lot of options to manage it. But the main thing here is when we're thinking about managing aphids, we want to make sure that we're choosing the appropriate product and application method for our site, right? If you're near water, you don't want to be doing a foliar application, right? Something like that. So here we have Transdect, which you can do as a soil application or a lower systemic bark spray. You'll note here, I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but you will note a lot, the first three at least on there. You can pretty much do the application anytime during the growing season, and we'll throw Lepitect in there too. All of these options move really rapidly into the tree itself. So, if you're out on a property in mid-May and you see aphids, you likely can come back the next week and do an application and still get good results for that season. A couple things to note though, Transtect Infusible and Zytec 10% are trunk injection options. However, you will have to come back every single year to do that treatment. And we're not currently recommending drilling and injecting a tree every single year if you don't have to. There are times where that might be the only option. You can't really do a soil application, you can't really do a foliar spray, or you can't do a bark spray either. And so the only way to knock back a population would be doing a tree injection. So just again, consider what your site is and how necessary some sort of intervention may be. So another thing I did want to talk about is aphids on lindens. Very, very common question. How do I manage aphids on lindens? I know specifically out in Oregon, Washington, it is, especially on the West Coast, a massive issue. A lot of your lindens are really, really big and they just rain down honeydew. So I get this question all the time because, of course, lindens are very important pollinator trees. So it's this what I'm about to walk through is not just for lindens specifically, really can be applied to any sort of pollinator specific tree or shrub that you might be dealing with aphids on. So the best bet is going to be doing a Lepitect soil injection. Notice it says soil injection. Per the label, you cannot do a drench. It has to be specifically injected with a soil injector tool. This product moves really, really quickly in the tree, and you may have to do a repeat application every 30 to 45 days, depending on the severity of the infestation itself. Again, we do have a tree injection, but kind of same rules. Because this product moves really, really quickly and then moves out of the tree very quickly, you might have to do a repeat injection, which is just not really best practice, especially to do more than one injection in a single year. You also have foliar application sprays. Again, just think about your site constraints and how difficult it might be to do or pull off a foliar application as well. Okay, so up next we have boring insects. Today we're just going to talk about emerald ash borer and bronze birch borer, and then just a quick shout out. We do have a bark beetle specific webinar on April 9th. So if you do want to sign up for that and you want to know more, there is an entire hour-long presentation webinar on it. So please sign up for that. I'm not even going to touch those topics today. Emerald ash borer, I'm going to do my best to get through this. I normally give this presentation in an hour long, so this is just going to be the really quick, hopefully quick version of it. But of course, you all, at least in Oregon, have been presented with the great burden of emerald ash borer back in 2022. So a couple things to note, it is an invasive species, right? We believe it came over from China with shipping material, probably in the 90s over in the Detroit metro area, and then it's really exploded across the entire United States since. So for those of you that are on in Idaho, I have some maps up, but it's in Colorado and it's in Oregon currently. So to get through this, all fraxinus are susceptible to emerald ash borer regardless of health. That's something that I hear a lot, where if I just baby my ash tree, if I mulch it, if I do good pruning, and if I water it appropriately and make sure, it's getting all the nutrients that it needs via fertilizing, then I'll be good. Eventually, emerald ash borer will find that tree and it will succumb to it if intervention is not taken. So just for some signs and symptoms here, you can get small vertical splits in the bark, and you can see that on the twigs or the main trunk, although I will argue most of this stuff, if you're seeing it on the main trunk, that tree is likely dead. So just know that if you're seeing it eye level, that tree is probably dead. Epicormic shoots, this is a tree's last ditch effort to try to survive, but of course we know that it probably won't bounce back just by shooting out epicormic shoots, right? Woodpecker holes and an increased activity. They're actually trying to sound and go for the larvae that are in those trees. The top 1/3 of the crowd dies first, and then it works its way down the tree. I know that there are a lot of parking lot ash trees that look like this, but if you do see this and you're in an area where there's potential to have emerald ash borer, please take a second look and then contact your state agencies appropriately for any additional sampling or anything that needs to occur. You get these S-shaped frass-filled larval galleries. There are a handful of other pests or insects, I should say, that do go attack ash trees, but it is important to note that emerald ash borer are going to be the only ones that make this distinct S-shaped gallery, right? A lot of the other ones are kind of all over the place, different sizes, different shapes, things like that. And then we'll have these D-shaped exit holes. So emerald ash borer and bronze birch borer that I'll talk about later are what's known as flathead borers. So they make this D-shaped exit hole when they're leaving the tree. And just important to note, they can't read English, so it's going to be in any orientation of D on the tree, right? It's not just going to be a normal D-shaped. And why do we care? Emerald ash borer has probably been the most devastating pest, at least in our spheres over the last 30 years, 20 years. And it can be really, really challenging for communities to bounce back, right? So this is just an example from Fort Wayne, Indiana, in the early days when we didn't know a whole lot about what was going on. So it was first discovered in 2006. In 2009, everything, is fine. The problem with emerald ash borer is typically when we find an infestation, we believe it's been there for about 6 years, because that's when we're seeing trees start to actually show symptoms. And then just 2 years later, that whole street has been decimated. And that's just an operational nightmare. I would hate to live on that street, trying to replant and regain that canopy. It's a really big impact, right? So here's current map. I pulled this last week from the USDA APHIS website. As you can see, most of the East Coast and Midwest has been impacted. All the purple shades are within the last 3 years confirmation. So it is still, moving. We can kind of see that Western movement and spreading. It's currently in 5 Oregon counties, I believe, and then it's also in Vancouver, British Columbia. So just zooming in here for you folks. So it's in Vancouver, British Columbia. It's confirmed in the Portland city limits this last summer. There is a highway that goes from Vancouver to Portland, right? So Washington, definitely keep your eyes peeled. You're right on the hot spot there. And then same for Idaho. If you go back to this map, you can see where the Denver metro area, if someone was driving from the Denver metro area up to Portland, they're probably passing right through Boise, right? And I know all these state agencies are doing an excellent job of getting out and doing scouting and sampling and engaging with the public and trying to get everyone on the same page. So when it comes to treatment, again, really quick here, there are 3 options that you can utilize. You can do a soil application of Zytect or Transtect. This is typically recommended for low pressure areas, outlier areas, or maybe you're like 40, 30 miles away from a current infestation, but still want to protect trees. You can do a bark spray of Transtect, same there, lower pressure. Both of those applications also would be best for smaller diameter trees, so less than about 25 inches. And then you can also do a microinjection with mectonite. The key to any of this, and really if you're trying to do any sort of chemical application at all for a certain pest, you want to make sure you have peaks amount of insecticide in the correct location for the correct life cycle that you're trying to target, right? So, for example, for emerald ash borer, the adults do feed on the leaves. However, they're not the life stage that we want to be targeting. They're not the issue. They're not the ones that are causing the damage. We're actually going after those larvae because they're the ones that are actually causing the girdling and causing the tree death, right? So for Zytect, you can do a soil application. This is a yearly application. You can do it, probably early in the spring or later in the fall. It does take about 90 days to get up fully distributed through the canopy. So you want to make sure you're giving yourself enough time so that way you have peak amount of insecticide from July to October-ish, right? Mectonite trunk injection, this lasts for 2 years, and you can apply that once you have 3/4 leaves development to when the trees start to change color. And again, you have 2 years of protection there. Then for Transtect, this product moves really, really quickly in the tree, so it goes up into the canopy in about 7 to 10 days. So you really have kind of the whole growing season to do it. But again, this is a yearly application as well. Okay. If you have more questions about emerald ash borer, I am happy to answer them. Your state agencies also have great resources too. But moving on to the cousin, bronze birch borer. For a lot of you, I know that this was kind of a precursor to emerald ash borer. You've been dealing with issues around bronze birch borer for a really long time and kind of had a similar mass die-off event of a lot of birch trees. But yeah, it's a flat-headed borer again. As you can see, it looks pretty similar to emerald ash borer. It is really attracted to the white bark birches. So specifically, trees that are not native to our area and we try to come in and plant, it's the opposite of emerald ash borer, right? Emerald ash borer is an invasive pest that attacks our native trees. And for most of the United States, bronze birch borer is a native pest that attacks our non-native trees, for the most part. There are situations where, native birch trees do still get attacked, but mostly because they're stressed. So we often think of bronze birch borer as a secondary pest. It typically doesn't go after very healthy trees. So doing a lot of cultural management is going to be key in managing this pest. So signs and symptoms, again, pretty similar to emerald ash borer. We're going to have top-down dieback, thinning, leaves yellowing. The larvae feed underneath the bark, so same situation. We're going to disrupt the flow of water to the canopy, and that's really the big issue here is those larvae. And then sometimes you might be able to see the wound tissue form around these disruptions, and then you can see these lumps happening here. Yeah, it's really, you see it a lot just driving around, the top-down dieback, the thinness of the birch trees. So the treatment options are pretty much the same thing because the insects are very closely related. So the big thing here with bronze birch borer that would be different from ash trees is trying to reduce stress and utilizing a lot of cultural management strategies in this is going to be key to actually managing bronze birch borer. These chemical applications are great to, fight back an initial infestation or trying to rehabilitate a tree in a certain way. But the biggest thing we want to try to do is reduce the stress of the tree. So proper mulching, watering, all of that good stuff. One other thing I will note too, because I have heard this a number of times, it may seem obvious, but emerald ash borer only go after ash trees, right? Bronze birch borer only go after birch trees. I know they look really, really similar, but it is important to note that the folks that named those did it in our favor, right? So bronze birch borer will only go after birch trees, right? But again, getting back to the treatment methods here, same concepts as emerald ash borer. You can do a Zytect soil application, either fall or early spring, bark spray or soil application of Transtect, or a trunk injection of Mectonite. It really depends on your site and what you're trying to accomplish as well. So getting into what is disease. I don't have enough time to go into the nitty-gritty of every single foliar disease that you guys might be dealing with. Again, that would take several hours. So I'm going to be making some generalizations when I go through this disease part of the presentation. So bear with me here. If you do have specific questions, I'm sure we can talk about them after, get them answered. But when we're thinking about disease, there's something called the disease triangle that I like to keep in mind, right? So disease basically is a susceptible host exposed to a pathogen in a conducive environment over time, right? So if we're thinking about managing a disease, we have to think about how we can modify one of these parts of the disease triangle. So if we can modify one of them, then we probably won't really have disease, right? So I'm going to talk through a specific leaf disease, and then we're going to go into some pretty vast generalizations, but just bear with me. So here's a couple examples of what you might be dealing with out there. Given your climate in the Pacific Northwest, specifically on the West Coast, you guys get a lot of rain. It's pretty cool. It's a pretty conducive environment, right? So you have a lot of different leaf diseases that you might be dealing with. But some common ones are pear trellis rust, cherry leaf spot, powdery mildew, anthracnose. Today I'm just going to talk about cherry leaf spot. So it affects flowering cherries and cherry laurels. It goes to the leaves. Sometimes it can be in the stems or the fruit, but mostly it's going after the leaves. And then really you get this like shotgun appearance on these leaves. So it just looks like, someone just shot it with a bunch of BB guns or the BBs that come out of a shotgun. I can't remember what the name of that is. But a lot of these foliar diseases, where we're seeing a lot of the impact is on the interior of the tree where, it's shaded, it stays cool, it stays wet. Again, that conducive environment. So what you might see if you have something like cherry leaf spot is as you get further into the season, you'll get yellowing leaves. Maybe they drop all their leaves and they're looking pretty ugly. You'll get a call from a homeowner that says, my tree is dying and I need you to do something right now. But we'll talk about the management later and why midsummer is probably not a great time to do something right now. So again, when we're thinking about managing disease and we're thinking back to the disease triangle, let's think if we can change or modify the environment. Cultural management, great. We can change the way our sprinklers run. So instead of having a kind of overhead sprinkler system like this, where it's just continually hitting those needles or those leaves and, spreading the spores around and creating that conducive environment, we could change it to something like a soaker hose, right? So it's still getting water, but we're not just creating more of a problem in the situation. We can also do things like mulching. We can rake up leaves that are infected with any sort of disease. You can also do some sort of pruning to try to get some more airflow going in there so you're not creating a conducive environment in some of these trees. We can also change or modify the host. I say as if that's a really easy thing to do. This is probably the hardest part of the disease triangle to try to manage. For most of us, it's not going to be that easy to be on site and be like, well, just cut it down and replace it, right? That's probably not going to be a super easy conversation to have. So you can change or modify the host. There are things out there that, they have bred to be resistant for certain foliar diseases, but, easier said than done, right? And then a novel way that we can think about changing or modifying the host is using plant growth regulators. So we are actually changing the way that the tree is responding or growing, right? So we are technically changing or modifying the host using plant growth regulators. That one's a little bit easier to digest versus just cutting a tree down and replacing it with something that's resistant. We can change or modify the pathogen itself via foliar sprays. This is probably one of the most common things that we see out there when it comes to management, right? And if we think back to our IPM and our toolbox approach, maybe it's doing a combination of pruning to promote airflow and doing a foliar spray depending on the pressure and how what your client's tolerance is, right? So when we're doing something like a foliar spray, the most vulnerable part of a tree is the new growth at the beginning of spring when it pops out. We do a fungicide application. That fungal spore tries to land on the leaf and it does not infect the leaf tissue. We come back 7 to 14 days later, same thing happens, right? And then depending on the situation, maybe we do a third spray as well, and we're getting the same effect here. So effectively, we're changing or modifying the pathogen, right? Because it's unable to infect those leaves. So, again, for some vast generalizations here, but the aim is to protect that new leaf surface. Again, that's the most vulnerable first thing in the spring. And the pattern that we typically like to follow is the first sprays happen when we just get a little bit of a mouse ear happening on these leaves when they're pretty new and fresh to the world. And then we want to do repeat applications at about a 2 week interval for a total of 2 to 3 applications. It really depends on timing, schedules, how you can get it accomplished, client's tolerance, things like that, if you need to do a 2 or 3 application. But it is really, really important that you get that first application timed correctly. So, if we're talking about doing some sort of foliar fungicide application, again, it's going to be a spray. So we want to make sure that we are targeting those internal areas of the tree, not just kind of hitting all the outsides and calling it a day, because again, that's the conducive environment, right? And then we want to make sure that we're rotating any fungicides based on mode of action as well. So for example, maybe you want to do Myclotect for your first spray, come back with Pegasus as your second spray, and so on and so forth, right? But we do want to make sure that we're rotating to prevent any sort of fungicide resistance that may occur. Getting into vascular wilts here, I'm going to talk about Dutch elm disease. This is probably the most prevalent of the vascular wilts out there because you guys don't really deal with oak wilt or anything similar to that. So the host are American elms, which is the most common. I'm going to not get on a rabbit hole to talk about Dutch elm resistant elms because we have seen some breakthrough cases with that in which they are actually succumbing to Dutch elm disease, but for the most part, American elms are the most susceptible. You get this leaf yellowing, curling, drooping, wilting effect. It is commonly referred to as flagging. So if you see a tree start to flag, it kind of looks like a yellow flag at the very tips. And that's the very first indicator that you may be dealing with something like oak wilt. It is also important to note that I have seen really heavy infestations of European elm scale that do manifest really similar to this photo here. And if you think that you see Dutch elm disease, it's important to get a sample or take a second look or send someone up in a bucket or a climber to look. If it's Dutch elm disease, you don't really have a lot of options to manage it if it's already infected. If it's European elm scale, great. You have a lot of treatment options and you can probably manage that pest appropriately. But symptoms begin to develop 4 to 6 weeks after infection, and really these trees are dying really fast. I had a few on my street a couple years ago, and Dutch elm disease was really bad that year, and it felt like within 3 to 4 weeks that tree was mostly wilted and being removed. So it does happen really, really quickly, especially when we think about tree time. It's vectored both by elm bark beetles and by root grafts, and again, this doesn't fit very neatly in the boxes that we like to fit other things into. It doesn't really matter if the tree is healthy or not. If the tree gets it, it will die. And then the tree's response is actually what ends up killing the tree itself. So the tree is responding by producing tyloses, which plugs up the vascular system. So it's trying to stop that Dutch elm disease from actually making its way through the tree itself, and the tree is responding and plugging up its own vascular system. So the fungus is called Ophistoma novo-ulmi, and it grows in the current year's wood-conducting tissue, otherwise known as the xylem, right? So the two ways Dutch elm disease is transmitted is elm bark beetles or root grafts. Elm bark beetles are pretty much the main cause of this, so about 90%, and then root grafts probably account for about another 10%. And when we're talking about root grafts, that really just means trees that are in close proximity to each other. So typically, think like a park setting or a backyard. If their canopies are touching, then that would be of concern for root graft transmission. So for the elm bark beetles, they feed in the crotches of 2 to 4 year old branches. Their whole life cycle is centered on elms, of course, and it's really important that you know that they feed in the 2 to 4 year old branches because that's going to make sense when we get into our management options here. But the other thing here is they are just the vectors. So they're not really causing damage like we see in, a bronze birch borer or some of the other bark beetles you may see or be familiar with out there. They're not really causing tree decline or damage. They're vectoring this disease that ends up declining the tree rapidly, right? So when we're thinking about management, we are going to talk about fungicide options. We're not going to talk about insecticide because if you treat a tree with insecticide and an elm bark beetle comes and chews on it, sure, the elm bark beetle might die, but it's now infected that tree with Dutch elm disease and game over, right? So we're just going to talk about doing a fungicide treatment. So for the management protocol here, scout trees, this is really, really important, especially if you're a municipality or a government entity and you want to preserve your canopy. Removing trees rapidly, so sanitizing once trees have Dutch elm disease or you've confirmed Dutch elm disease, quickly removing them so that way there's not a place for these elm bark beetles to reproduce. They like to reproduce in dead and dying trees and branches, so just immediately removing them to try to reduce the population. Severing roots, this doesn't happen as much as it probably should, but you can do trenching to stop that root graft transmission if there are other elms nearby that you do want to protect. Tracing, not a super common practice anymore, but if you do see flagging, you can kind of cut out sections until you trace the disease all the way back, and then you can cut that out and do a treatment. It's really a complex situation, and there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to save that tree. And then protection. So high volume macro infusion with Arbortect. So why macro infusion? This image here with the blue and the green really highlights this. So with macro infusion, sometimes we're doing 2 to 4 times as many injection sites as we would with something like a micro injection. So a micro injection would be what we would use for emerald ash borer or bronze birch borer, right? Microinjection works great for insecticides and if you're trying to go after an insect. So it moves super well in the tree. You don't really need to get into every nook and cranny of a tree because eventually that insect's going to hit it and die before really causing big issues for the tree. When we think about something like Dutch elm disease, we want to make sure that we're drilling plenty of holes, using a high volume of water, and getting really good distribution. Because if you recall, those elm bark beetles feed in those 2 to 4-year-old crotches, which is all the way up in the top of these trees, right? Some of these elm trees are absolutely massive, so we want to make sure that we're getting enough product all the way up there, and every nook and cranny has a fungicide in it, so that way there's no chance of an escape, have you. So just really quickly going over some of the basics of treatment here. American elms have their own rate. Other elms have a different rate. And then just a note, camperdown elms should not be treated with Arbortect. They're very, very sensitive to this product, so do not treat camperdown elms with it. And then you may have to reduce the dosage depending on if the canopy is missing or something like that too. You can do it throughout the entire growing season, so once the leaves come out to about fall color. And then every 3 years, although if you're in an area where the infestation is super, super high, you may want to come back at 2 or 2.5 years just to be sure if it's a tree that you absolutely cannot lose. So if you're dealing with a city or a client in a city that's just not really managing Dutch elm disease and there's a lot of dead elms everywhere, you might want to do 2 or 2.5 knowing that pressure might be super high. Okay, so wrapping it all up, I know that was kind of a quick and dirty version of just a handful of things that you all might deal with in your respective areas, but I just want to make sure that we're clear that not every issue warrants immediate action. So not every single insect or disease that we're seeing on the landscape requires like 5 chili alarm, drop everything, do something right now action. Some we can probably, maybe give it a year, come back and monitor, do cultural issues and try to manage it that way. Others we probably will, such as invasive species, because again, they don't fit into a lot of the boxes that we generally think of when it comes to a lot of our other pests and diseases. And then lastly, just think of it all as a toolbox approach. Not spraying and praying, not just saying this one product works for everything and is going to address every single issue that I want. And then the last bullet that I didn't put on here, but also just knowing your insect biology, knowing what damage looks like of different categories of insects, and then knowing, your timing and when it is appropriate to do a treatment if you're doing a chemical application and the life cycle that you're trying to treat.